Okay, yeah, well, talking about the habitat suitability mapping that we've undertaken for the Mount Lofty Ranges chestnut rump heath wren, and how we've used that for some conservation planning and particularly fire management planning. I particularly want to acknowledge amongst the authors here Luke Price, who's been responsible for driving a lot of this. He put the abstract in and then conveniently flew off to the UK on Sunday. And also Marcus Pickett, who's the lead author there. Marcus has actually done all of the field work on this, so really the bulk of the knowledge, many of the skills really need to be attributed to him. So this is the challenge we have in the Mount Lofty Ranges, where we have houses in amongst native vegetation that clearly presents a bushfire risk, and the department has a responsibility to try and help manage that bushfire risk. And the challenge is how we do that when we also have threatened species using those habitats. The threatened species we're talking particularly about here, we've got 3 nationally endangered species, that Mount Lofty Ranges chestnut rump heath wren, the southern brown bandicoot and Bassian thrush, that all use those kind of heathy woodlands, heathy to shrubby woodlands. And their ongoing viability, I guess, is going to be very much dependent on having really well ecologically informed fire management. But to have ecologically informed fire management, you actually need good ecological information. And so that's what we've tried to start doing, particularly with the heath wren, is improve that distributional information about the species and habitat requirements to inform our fire management. Step back a bit. So here's a picture of the critter here, a nationally endangered species. It's a very small bird with relatively limited dispersal capability, and persists often in habitats that are relatively isolated, heath-dominated habitats. And again, population viability is going to depend on careful burn planning. So in 2007 and 2008, we had some funding and decided to try and just really confirm the species distribution for a start. There's lots of historical records for the species, but we weren't even sure which of those populations were still extant, and the relative importance of the various populations, the extent of habitat. So we contracted Marcus Pickett, who is a great ornithologist and works as a contractor, to survey all of the locations where there were historic records. And he did that. You don't really need to see this map, but just essentially extends from way up here near kind of Williamstown right down to Deep Creek. And what happened during that process is Marcus got a really good understanding of the species habitat requirements, because he was visiting areas where they had occurred but no longer occur, as well as those areas where they were still occurring. So it allowed him to kind of hone his knowledge of what the requirements of that species appeared to be. And we used that information to then ask Marcus to help us get a bit more detailed knowledge, particularly in those areas where we were likely to be undertaking quite a bit of prescribed burning. And so Marcus developed some fantastic habitat maps for us, and what he did, as you can see, essentially has habitat suitability there, and really what you need to know is just the darker the green, the better the quality of the habitat. We didn't have a lot of money to do this, but what we were able to do is just incrementally, every time we got a bit more money, do a bit more mapping in these priority areas. So it's been quite a good strategy for us to gradually improve our knowledge over time. So just zooming in as an example of how we'd use this mapping, all this mapping sits in our GIS systems, and when we have a proposed burn, it gets overlaid, and I can then very clearly see what proportion of the burn contains chestnut rump heath wren habitat, where the adjacent habitat is, and the extent of that habitat. And that allows me to make an assessment of whether or not I think that burn is likely to have an impact on the species or not. So as the years went on, some of those habitats got burnt, and so then we asked Marcus to come back again and resurvey some of those those burnt areas to see how long it was taking the birds to recolonise those patches. We also had a slightly separate project at Scott Creek Conservation Park where Dave Payton and Dragos Moyes did some pre and post fire leg banding of the birds and monitored them pre and post fire. And what they found, what Dragos found at Scott Creek was that the heath wrens that were able to persist in a relatively large unburnt patch, and then within 2 years they were starting to use the regenerating habitat that was surrounding. Marcus interestingly found very similar things at a prescribed burn site in Morialta Conservation Park. So I think they started using them less than a year after the fire, but certainly within 2 years post-fire. And then by 6 years post-fire, they almost seem to be preferentially using that regenerating habitat at both Scott Creek and Mark Oliphant. So this started to change our thinking a little bit about the heath wren and started us questioning, well, is this species actually preferring early unburned habitat? Interestingly, when we'd done those first distribution surveys, there really wasn't any recently burnt habitat, so there was a bit of a knowledge gap there as a result. So in line with that, there was also anecdotal information that there were population declines occurring at sites where there was pretty much only long unburnt habitat. So particularly Deep Creek Conservation Park and Cox Scrub, where there had been some monitoring that Marcus was doing for southern emu wrens. And he was noting that the emu wrens were declining, but so were the heath wrens, and started questioning whether this had to do with vegetation succession. While we were formulating this, there was actually concurrently a Victorian study happening, and that was presented at the Ecological Society conference end of last year. And at the same time, they were also finding this preference for early successional vegetation, which was interesting. So they only found the species occurring in habitat that was less than 8 years old. And that's particularly interesting because their survey was going out to test some models developed by experts about the different age classes they thought various species would occur in to help inform their fire planning. And all of the experts had predicted that the species wouldn't be found in early successional vegetation and would be found increasingly in mature and very long unburnt vegetation. So they actually found the exact opposite when they undertook surveys. Now that's not likely, that's not saying that the species isn't ever going to occur in long unburnt habitat. It obviously does, and the extent to which its habitat preferences are probably largely driven by habitat structure. So how a given habitat responds to fire is likely to indicate how suitable it is for the species. But some examples here, this is habitat at Cox Scrub 30 years following Ash Wednesday fires, and you can see just quite a lot of shrub senescence and open spaces and relatively low species diversity compared, admittedly, very different habitat type here. But you can just see the structure of this really productive regenerating habitat here. So just quite an interesting comparison. Now, just a further interesting part to the story, many of you may remember that in 2013 there was a bushfire in Cox Scrub Conservation Park, which unfortunately was the result of an escaped prescribed burn. So this is the extent of Cox Scrub here. The hatched area here and that little strip along there is a prescribed burn undertaken in 2010 and those ones in 2007. This is a bushfire from 2006, and this was the 2013 prescribed burn that then just got a little bit bigger. And there was a CFS back burn, I think, along here, so hence that very large burnt area. And what Luke did is he had the foresight to, after this burn had occurred, to contact Marcus. We were obviously worried about the heath wren population in that park, and Luke decided to set up some long-term monitoring. Luke decided to get Marcus to set up some long-term monitoring. And I know that the legend's a bit small, but what you need to know is that green is good. So Marcus did, within this grid system, looked at the habitat suitability and also did bird surveys using call playback. So this is the good habitat here in these burnt areas. Not surprisingly, the birds aren't using, this is very recently burnt habitat here, so it's not suitable. You can see there's some good habitat in the 2006 bushfire area. And importantly, all the birds are using this good habitat in the unburnt area. Now, fast forward to last year, 2015, and the really interesting thing is that within this bushfire area, you can see it's now blue. So the habitat has started recovering, but it's still not what Marcus would deem as good quality. It's now moderate quality. But the really interesting thing to note is the birds aren't using what we're deeming good quality. They're all in, they've moved into this moderate quality and in this bushfire area here. So this is really interesting, and that it's further supporting this idea that they are preferring early successional vegetation, and also that maybe our concept of habitat suitability needs to be refined a bit more, and that Marcus would have predicted that this was the better quality habitat. The birds are telling us something slightly different. And as I said, when Marcus first did those surveys to try and work out where the birds were and get an idea of habitat quality, there weren't any early successional habitats that the birds were using, so hence he wouldn't have picked that up. So in terms of achievements, really this method, you know, we've had to cobble together money over time, but it's actually turned out to be a really good method of getting quick information, enabling us to make really timely, well-informed decisions, and has surprised us, I think, in the extent to which it has improved our understanding of heath wren habitat quality. I haven't spoken about this, but it's actually also improved our understanding of the burn intensity required by the species. This species, the habitat regeneration appears to be much better with a moderate to high intensity burn, so that's what we do our best to achieve. There are, as there always are, a number of challenges. This is obviously very reliant on the perception and skills of the person doing the surveys, and the perception of habitat quality is based on the available habitat that's there, and you obviously need to adjust that as things change. Also, this is a very dynamic thing. Obviously, the habitat maps go out of date relatively quickly as the habitat changes, so we're going to need to keep updating them. From a fire management perspective, we're not just managing for chestnut-rumped heath wrens, we have to manage for all species within those habitats, so that just brings an added layer of complexity. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.